The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees, assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented tonight. We do not endorse any recommendations or opinions made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introductions of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the Program Coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Thanks, Kelly, and good evening and welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight for another webinar in our summer series that we are calling TS Roadmap, Alternative Routes. I'm pleased to introduce you all to our speaker this evening, Dr. Vincent Kiechlin. Dr. Kiechlin received his Bachelor of Science degree in 1985 from St. Peter's College, New Jersey, and his doctorate of chiropractic in 1988 from Los Angeles College of Chiropractic. His search for innovative solutions to his son's neurological problems led Dr. Kiechlin to continue his studies at the Carrick Institute in Florida, where he completed specialized programs of study in the treatment of ADHD, learning disabilities, and behavioral disorders, as well as the treatment of vertigo and balance disorders. A practicing clinician of chiropractic neurology since 2000, Dr. Kiechlin successfully achieved diplomat status through the American Board of Chiropractic Neurology in 2003. Dr. Kiechlin focuses on a non-drug, non-surgical approach to healthcare. He specializes in the treatment of children with learning and behavioral disabilities and difficult-to-treat neurological disorders. I am happy to now turn the program over to you, Dr. Kiechlin.
Thank you so much, Marty. Excuse me, and thank you, everybody, for allowing me to speak this evening. I want to talk about something tonight that I am extremely passionate about, and that is the brain and the nervous system, and especially how it relates to behavior and the motor system and how it relates with children. So I kind of got into this whole thing. My son was born with a club foot about 10 years ago, and I remember hearing the doctor's explanation for, why he had that, turn in his foot. And I just remember looking at his calf and thinking, that looks like a really big muscle spasm to me. That looks neurologically based. So anyway, it really made me, want to seek out more on the nervous system to help my son. And it ended up, leading me into this whole neurology program that I'm involved in now. So tonight what I want to talk about first is how the brain works normally, because I really think it's important that we understand how the brain works, because I believe movement and behavior problems are physical problems. That this is really a physical thing wrong with the brain. And if we want to change those things, we need to figure out how we're going to change the brain physically. And that's very important. So I think we need to know kind of some of the basic things and the rules on how the brain works normally, so that we know, we can understand, let's say, how to change things and create change in the nervous system. Okay? So let me just kind of go to the first slide here. There we go. Okay, so the rules of neurology. These are basic rules that are really inherent to all nerve cells. And I was hoping to start off the seminar tonight with a quick video. It's a little bit of video about how basically what this doctor did was he took a petri dish of rat brain cortex cells, so that fluffy part of our skull, or of our brain rather, that we all think of when we look at the brain. What he did is he had taken some pieces of these, or just some of the cells out of that rat's brain, dissolve them in a petri dish, and hook them up to a flight simulator. And basically what he did, what he showed, was that the petri dish of rat brain cells taught itself how to fly the plane. And nobody showed it how to do it. Not only did it teach it how to do it, but it taught itself all by itself. So based on putting input into the flight simulator, having the plane crash a few times, learning from that crash, and then trying again until it got so good at it that it, as it says in the video, I'm going to try to put this video up on on the website, or I'll give it to the society here, where the plane taught itself to fly as good as any fighter pilot in thunderstorms and mountain ranges. So why would I want to show that tonight? Because I wanted to show you that Brain cells, they inherently want to connect to other cells. They want to talk, okay? But first, let's go through some of the rules. Nerve cells have basically two functions. The first function is to survive. That's their primary function, is they want to live. The secondary function is to receive and transmit information. So, you know, many times I'll have patients come in and they'll tell me that they've had MRIs and scans and all these different things done, you know, to try to find out where is the problem, and everything is told, they're told everything's normal. Well, understand that when you look at certain imaging, you're really only looking at the structure. They don't tell you basically what's happening in those areas. So, you know, from my perspective, those cells could just be in survival mode. It doesn't mean that they can't do the work. It's just that nobody's asked them to, or they're in a survival mode where they can't do that work, you know, functionally. So, okay, let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so what do nerve cells need to survive? They need three basic things. These are things that all nerve cells must have before they can do that receiving and transmitting information. And the first thing they need is oxygen. Okay, we all know we get oxygen from our lungs, exercise, etc. The second thing they need is fuel. That's what we eat. We need to have a good diet. Whoops, sorry, I popped that back. We need a good diet. And then the third thing that nerve cells must have is stimulation. Stimulation is just as important as in fuel and oxygen. and we need to know, where does that stimulation come from in order, if we want to change that brain. So where does the stimulation come from? It comes from the environment. So what do I mean by that? I mean that what do we expose our body to throughout the day? So what are the five senses basically? So we have vision, we have hearing, we have taste, we have smell, we have touch. These are all the things that we learn in grade school, and all of those things combined only equal 5%. So where is the other 95% of the stimulation to our brain come from? Okay, something that we don't even really think about. Where does it come from? It comes from stimulation from the vestibular system and the muscles and joints that resist gravity. Because basically the other 95% of the stimulation to our brain, most of it, the majority of it, comes from gravity. Okay, very important. And why is that the case? Because if you look, the first five senses, they come and go. They're never constant. Gravity is always there. It's always constant. Our brains are always exposed to it. If you go to NASA's website, you can look and see some of the physiologic changes that happen to astronauts when they're put in an anti-gravity environment. And they have changes from rapid heart rates to high blood pressure to cognitive changes such as memory loss to vertigo to all different types of brain symptoms because gravity was taken away. They lost some of that stimulation. Okay? Just back a little bit. If we think about the muscles and joints that resist gravity, where are those muscles and joints? Where would we primarily think they would be? And as I said at the bottom there, they come mostly from the spine and especially from the neck. Okay? There's extra receptors up in our neck, many more than we have in the rest of our spine. Okay. So when nerve cells are healthy, they have the ability to grow connections with other brain cells in accordance to the stimulation they receive. This is known as neuroplasticity. That is a great word to Google. Neuroplasticity is a fabulous word. You'll find eons and oodles and oodles and oodles of different information that you can find. And basically what is neuroplasticity? That is when the brain grows and cuts certain connections that it needs or doesn't need based on the environmental stimulation that we give it. So we know that the brain can change. We know that there are mechanisms to change it. It comes from the environment. And then understand that if that's the case, then all learning is the mechanisms that I'm talking about here. This is how all learning occurs. Okay? In other words, if you get anything out of this webinar tonight, it's because there is a physical change in your brain. Your brain made new connections to remember this. Okay? So the brain acts much like muscles in that the more you use it, the more it will grow and improves its ability to function more efficiently and for longer periods of time, which kind of just says what I just said. Okay? How does it work? Well, when nerve cells are stimulated, these cells make new protein inside the cell, and protein is what the cell is predominantly made of. So it allows it to make itself, basically, so it can keep itself itself healthy by replacing all the little organelles that we had to memorize in grade school and biology class. You know, the lysosomes and the nucleus, and all those things change when a cell is stimulated. As a matter of fact, how your cells make new proteins is that they create new genes that are templates for protein replication. So why is that important? Because the branches that we're going to grow to promote that learning are made of protein. So we need the cell, in other words, if the cell is going to change its structure to become more efficient, and it does that through growing more branches so that it can connect to more nerve cells and improve its efficiency, then it needs to make protein. And that is done through stimulation, okay, as long as oxygen and glucose are present as well. Okay, protein, as I said, is used to grow those new connections. And that increases, protein also increases the ability of neurotransmitter production. And what are neurotransmitters? Neurotransmitters are basically, they're these little chemicals. See, nerve cells don't, most nerve cells, not all, but most nerve cells don't touch directly to each other. So when a message comes down the nerve cell, when it's trying to receive and then transmit to the next guy to pass the ball off, so to speak, it has to jump a gap. Well, these neurotransmitters are these little chemicals that help the electrical message that ran down the nerve jump that gap to become another electrical message for the next nerve so that it can do its job and continue that transmission. So understand that neurotransmitters are not going to be produced in the brain unless there's a message. There has to be a message first. Then the neurotransmitter passes that message. Okay, so that is their function, is to just relay a message. But if the environment doesn't put one there in the first place, in other words, if the environment doesn't trigger that message to happen, then you're not going to see neurotransmitter release. Okay, so because there is no message. That's their job. Okay, second rule. Whatever nerve cells are born on the same day are connected together until the day you die. Okay, so let's look at what that could mean. If we look at a picture here of the brain, we can see that there's different colorized versions here. That big, giant, fluffy part, the green, the reddish color, the yellow, and the purple, that's all the cortex of the brain, where predominantly most of the studies on behavior and motor activities are done. And this nice little purple guy at the bottom called the cerebellum, that actually grows off the back of the brainstem. And the cerebellum is a very unique region of the brain because it's the main region of the brain that feels gravity first. And if you look up, you know, in the old days, people used to think the cerebellum's function was to control and coordinate all motor activity. That's the blurb that you'll see out of most textbooks. And basically that is true, but the cerebellum is a huge sense organ. And all senses pass through that region of the brain. And why is that important? Because that's where the messages are going up into the brain. And what's interesting about the cerebellum is it not only feels all that gravity first and then controls the postural muscles, okay, but it also initiates thinking in the contralateral side of the brain, meaning on the other side of the brain. So my right cerebellum, there's two halves to that. There's a side view, so we can't see both halves. But the right cerebellum would therefore be directly connected to the left side of the brain and vice versa. So when that cerebellum is activated, it initiates all activity in that contralateral side of the brain. Very important, okay? Because one of the ways to create change in the brain is through stimulation, and gravity comes into that region first, okay? All right, does all stimulation promote a healthy brain? No. I mean, there's lots of stimulations that are not healthy for the brain. Stimulation must be provided in a way that's not too much and not too little. And the stimulation must also be provided in a way that promotes symmetrical brain activity. That's where we start getting into a little bit of the brain asymmetry portion of the lecture here tonight. Basically, we have two halves to our brain, and each half is packed with different functions. And it's actually an evolutionary improvement because now you can squeeze more jobs into the same, or into a smaller area of the brain, basically. You can grow more brain tissue, have more jobs done, but now each side of the brain is going to be specialized for certain jobs and certain activities. A lot of those activities on each side of the brain have a similar function, but they're all different, obviously. Okay. What we find, what I find in my practice, is that many of the children with behavior problems and motor problems, it's not that their brains are not broken. It's just that they're not balanced. And an imbalanced brain will look like it's broken when it's really not. Okay, it's just not balanced. So I want to go past that for a second. We'll come back to that. So the importance of symmetrical brain activity. Most of us use both sides of our brain to perform routine daily activities. Many disorders of the body are associated with asymmetrical brain activity. Optimal brain activity occurs when it functions in a symmetrical fashion, which is basically what I just said. Okay, so let me give you some examples. For instance, when we read with really both sides of our brain. The left side of the brain moves our eyes across the page, but it's the right side of the brain that's picking up the big picture of what's being said. It's creating an image in our mind of what we're reading. So some kids are great at reading, but they don't understand what they've read. And other children are terrible at reading, but what they do read, they get. And why? Because one side of the brain is not balanced and compared to the other. What do I mean by imbalance? It's just that one side is not running at a quicker rate. It's not, or it's running too fast. It could be either one. But whatever it is, one side is doing more than the other. I love using the example of Rain Man, that most people have seen the movie. If you think about Rain Man had exceptional abilities in some aspects, and yet he was very poor in others. He was extremely good at detail things, whereby he could count 1,000 matchsticks in a millisecond, or he could count, 7 decks of cards, I believe is what it was, at a casino, things that most people can't do. Yet the other side of his brain, the social side of his brain, is extremely inept. Okay, but yet he was alive. He was a person. I mean, his brain worked, but it did not work in a symmetrical fashion. So he had incredible abilities in some aspects, but he was extremely poor in others. Okay, let me see if I used. Okay, here's a nice picture of a young man. I believe he is actually from New Jersey, where I practiced. And this is a cover of Time magazine, and there's a picture of a child with autism. And if you look at him, if we look at his face and we can see that he's got quite a head tilt. And when I first saw this picture, I thought, wow, what's wrong with that vestibular system on this kid? Because really what he's doing is he's tilting his head, most likely to compensate for the fact that his brain is not balanced and therefore his eyes don't line up. So he needs to tilt his head in order to make his vision clear. And most people, you'll see, if you start looking, you'll see many people tilt their head and they don't realize that they're doing it. The reason why they do it is because their eyes don't line up, because their brain is not balanced most of the time. I mean, there's other reasons for this stuff, but that is a pretty big mechanism, and that would be my guess in this child, that he did not resist gravity properly, and therefore his brain was not balanced, and that's why he was diagnosed with autism, because autism, from all the cases that I've seen, are an imbalance. Okay. Symptoms believed to be, let me go through some of the things that you might see with a right and left brain. There are many others. I have a half an hour here to speak tonight, so I'm giving you a smattering, but there are many different types of symptoms that can be associated with deficits on each side. But understand, too, that not all these are written in stone. There's obviously exceptions. There's overlaps. And why are all these could be different is because everybody's brain is different. Not all of us are the same. I always like to think of brains are kind of like fingerprints. From a distance, they all kind of look alike. But when you look really close, they're completely different, just like fingerprints. It's completely different as the people who have them, really. Okay? So if we look at symptoms associated with deficits in the right brain, these are typically children who have difficulty with focusing attention. Why is that the case? Because the right brain especially, both sides of our brain do this, but the right frontal lobe especially helps us fixate our eyes on targets. And if you think about it, if we have an attention problem, what physically has to happen in order for us to attend to something? Well, most of the time, you have to look at it. You have to physically look at the target. And if you're easily distracted by things in your periphery, then you're going to have extreme difficulty focusing on a target. And our frontal lobe does that. Because what our frontal lobe does is it inhibits lower systems that would dart to the periphery at anything that moves, like my dog Puff would do. Okay, if I have a ball in my hand and I throw it to my dog and she runs and gets it, and I have another ball in my hand and I throw it past her while she's grabbing that, she's going to drop the ball she got and go after the one that's moving because she doesn't have a good frontal lobe. She's a dog. Okay, so when I see people with attention problems, typically you're going to see problems with that right frontal lobe. Okay, these children tend to be impulsive. They have obsessive and repetitive thoughts or actions. Why? Because those are really things that the left brain does really well. Okay, you're going to see autism. You may see poor spatial orientation and memory. You may have visual spatial difficulties. Why? These are all the things that the right brain does well. They may get lost easily, inappropriate or poor social behaviors. Why? Because understanding social behaviors, we have to pick up nonverbal cues. So the right brain is usually associated with nonverbal communication, the left brain with our verbal communication. So really from, when babies are born to about 18 to 24 months of their life, they're using mostly that right brain because they're not very verbal at that point in their life. They're more going on social cues, okay, and visual cues, okay. And then they tend to have to draw and write on the right side of the paper because the left brain sees that side more than the right, okay. Okay, let's go to the next. These are symptoms associated with, I continued, I didn't realize I gave you even more. The ADHD, poor geometry skills, once again, that's a visual spatial thing. Poor math reasoning skills, meaning understanding the math itself as opposed to just crunching the numbers. Tends to focus on small details. Why? Because that's a big left brain thing. The right brain sees the big picture of things. Inability to decide quickly or grasp things. Lack of imagination or pretense to play. Why? Because these are all nonverbal things that we do. Avoids eye contact. Why? Once again, because I can't fixate on targets. Okay? I say a lot of these kids will fixate. I've had people say, well, they're hyper-focused on certain things. And I'm here to tell you that that hyper-focus is usually on detail things, or things that are emotional, like a video game display or something of that nature. These children usually do not enjoy reading, usually have poor reading comprehension, and Tourette syndrome is usually associated with dysfunction of the right side of the brain. Okay. Deficits associated with left brain function. There's depression. Okay. Why? Because our left brain is our happy brain. It's our approach brain. The right brain has a withdrawal function. Tends to be more, these are your shy kids with the high-functioning right brain. Ventricular heart disease can be associated with the left brain. I didn't throw this in on the other one, but the right brain can be associated with heart disease, such as atrial arrhythmias and things of that. Not the only mechanism for both of these heart conditions, but it is a mechanism. I've had many patients come to me with heart arrhythmias, and they'll tell me the doctors say there's nothing wrong with my heart. Well, if that's the case, then it must be the connection to the heart, because the heart is a muscle, just like your bicep. Okay, so it needs a nerve to tell it what to do. Dyslexia is usually associated with the left brain, although it can be right brain as well. Scoliosis. Why would I throw scoliosis in? That's kind of a back thing. Scoliosis, once again, is the brain's not sure where its center of gravity is. Where is it in space? That's a brain thing. So it's compensating and calibrating by curving in order to find that center of gravity, that balance. So, there are many treatments for scoliosis. There aren't many successful treatments, but scoliosis, and the reason being is everybody focuses on the back. And the control mechanism of our spine and the muscles of our spine is really in our brain and our brainstem through the cerebellum is where that exists. And especially the right cerebellum, which is hooked up to that left brain. Okay? Bipolar disorder can also be a problem with the left brain. Memory problems, especially declarative memory, such as facts and figures and things of that nature. Auditory processing problems. The right brain is a more auditory, the left brain is more auditory in nature. The right brain is more visual spatial. And then there's fibromyalgia. It can also be associated with left brain deficits and schizophrenia as well. So what I just presented to you was left and right brain function dysfunction, or imbalances, I should say, between the two, and these are the conditions that can result in that. I'm also going to go back a little bit here. I want to show you a few of these pictures. There can also be let me go back to this one. There can also be an imbalance between the older part of our brain and the newer part of our brain. Because when we're born as babies, we have basically this older part. That's why babies don't walk, they don't talk, they don't speak. They're pretty much helpless when they're first born. And then as they grow, they start to, crawl and walk and speak and do all these things. So as that occurs, newer layers are constantly being grown as the baby grows. And then those new layers come back down and inhibit the older layers. So my young child may want to watch Barney one day, and then, several months later, all of a sudden doesn't like Barney anymore. Now I want to watch SpongeBob or whatever. Why? How does that happen? Well, something physically in the brain changed, where now, instead of playing with stuffed animals, the child wants to play with trucks. Well, what happened is the newer layers grew, and then they inhibited the older layers. And what we see in a lot of these children is that, and adults for that matter, is that the newer brain, as it grows, it's not inhibiting the older brain, or it can't grow strong enough to inhibit the older brain. So if we look here at this picture, we can see this is a region of the old brain, and you can see it's fed by the brainstem here. And over here, along here, which this picture is not showing, or I should say over here rather, there is a cerebellum that's coming up and feeding this region. And then this region takes the handoff and starts feeding up into these other regions of the brain, okay, especially these older regions. If you think about a baby inside the womb, what senses are they exposed to? They're exposed to not much light. It's pretty dark in there. It's pretty quiet in there. There's not a lot of sounds except for maybe mommy's heartbeat and gut sounds. So what are they exposed to? Gravity and movement. That's something they feel right away. And that vestibular system forms right away. It's one of the first systems to form in our brain. Remember, the vestibular system, again, feels gravity. Vestibular system is your inner ear. It's the gyroscopes in our inner ears. Okay, if I didn't point that out, I apologize, okay? Then, so you can see, so as this region grows, as we become adults, it feeds the old brain, but it also feeds this new layer, this new brain that's growing, this adult brain that's growing, and then this brain comes back down and inhibits that. I believe I have a nice picture here where that brainstem, once again, here's our new brain being fed and our old brain from that region. And then as the new brain is growing, it starts to come back and inhibit the old brain. So I don't like Barney anymore. I want to watch SpongeBob. And then this other little guy over here, he's coming back down to regulate how much is being shot up here and how much is going to this limbic area. So the frontal lobe is beautiful in that it has the ability to regulate how much stimulation it gets so it doesn't get too much. And then it also has the ability to regulate how much these old areas get so they don't become too dominant. So what is a limbic area? What are the old brains? It's your alligator brain. It's your emotional brain. It's your aggression brain. It's your fear and panic brain. Okay, that limbic brain. And then our prefrontal cortex comes up and dampens that. Okay, we've all known people with panic attacks, and half the times they don't even know why they're in panic. And a lot of times it's because this little connection right here isn't doing its job. Okay, and that's what this picture is showing here, is that if this area does not get enough input, that frontal cortex does not grow, for whatever reason, it could be because there's not enough gravity coming in from the cerebellum over here to feed it, then we're going to see a loss of limbic regulation, a loss of regulation to the stimulation to the limbic brain. Now there's nothing to stop that limbic brain from getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So our child becomes angrier, more obsessive, more compulsive, more panic, more fear, you name it, whatever that area does, more aggression. Okay, so that's very, very important that you understand that there's not just a right to left, but there's also a top to bottom on each side as well. And all of those things need to be balanced. Okay. All right, let's see. Okay, it has been stated that the way to measure intelligence is not based on the amount of cells in our brain, but the amount of connections that we have. So they're now finding that one of the ways to test and measure intelligence is through connectivity. Give you a little statistic here. They now know that, or is statistically shown, that the higher your level of formal education, the less likely you are to develop some of these late-in-life dementias such as Alzheimer's and Pick's disease and senility, etc. And why? Because people tend to use their brain more. You know, they went to school longer. They're being forced to use their brain more. So connections are the key. And the most connections come from gravity. Okay, this is the last slide I was going to show you. It was once again another video of what learning looks like. And basically what this was just a nice little quick video of nerve cells in a petri dish being stimulated. And you watch these things, and all they want to do is connect to each other. And as I said, I'll try to post these on the website to so that people can watch them if they want, or at least how to get to them. Okay, I'm finished with my talk. I want to just give everyone a few little things here if you want to read more about some of the topics I talked about. The first book is called Magic Trees of the Mind. This is a great one for the folks in our audience who do not have a lot of background in science or anatomy, etc. This woman, Miriam Diamond, is a neurodevelopmental researcher. She's done many great, wonderful papers, and it's a great book on really that neuroplasticity and how your child works. And she gives you, or how the brain develops, and she gives you some really nice hints to help children. This next book is Cerebellum and Cognition. This is more for the folks in the audience who have a science background and understand a little bit about how the cerebellum works in general. This is a great book, though, because it talks a lot about the cerebellum, and obviously the book is it goes through motor systems, sensory systems, and autonomic regulation. You know, the cerebellum is a huge player in our brain, and it's the one part of our brain that feels gravity. It's the main part that feels gravity. Okay. There's another. Whoops, I lost it. There's another thing: the neurophysiologic implications of learning. This is a PhD synopsis by Dr. Carrick. This was written for teachers. Okay, he has a PhD in education. This might be one for the, I understand there's some educators in the audience. That might be one. You get that through the Carrick Institute. And then brain asymmetry. There's actually 2 volumes of this. And the authors, or the editors rather, are Richard Davidson and Kenneth Hugdell. Both of these doctors have done tremendous amount of research on brain asymmetry. If you Google, you know, brain asymmetry OCD, brain asymmetry ADHD, brain asymmetry Tourette's, or you name it, you just Google those things. What you will see, you'll see their names pop up on many of these papers that are published. And that's a great resource for, and that's once again a little bit thick, that book, but you can just Google a lot of those papers yourself. And then the last book I want to talk about is Disconnected Kids by Dr. Robert Melillo, and he is a chiropractic neurologist like myself. And this is a nice book for parents out there, because basically what this book does is it goes through a brain balancing program. It teaches you what to look for, how to test for those imbalances, and then he goes through certain protocols on how to correct them. So that is a really good resource for folks out there who may not have the financial means or the time to try some brain balancing program, you know, at an office. They can go to this book, and it's a wonderful. I really recommend most people grab that book. Okay, I'm finished talking. Thank you so much for having me. I'll be available now to answer any questions, and thank you once again for having me.
Dr. Kiechlin, thank you very much. And now we're going to launch ourselves right into some questions that have been showing up here.
Okay, great.
I have a question, and I have to say right up front, I don't know very much about autism, so I'm not quite sure I understand what this is. I'm hoping that you do. But I have a question about autism Bales.
What was that last word?
Bales, B-A-L-E-S is how it's spelled, but I'm not sure. I tried to clarify that to know if that was the correct way of spelling it, so I'm not sure, but that was the question, if you had any information on autism Bales.
I am not sure. No, I don't. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right. And it probably was just a typo or something, but I couldn't clarify it. So if you think you have a child or a patient that is unbalanced, what types of therapies or activities are the most useful?
I believe the most useful activities are the motor exercises that we do. I find those to be the most useful. Why? Because the motor system has the greatest influence on our brain, because the cerebellum picks up that motor system the most, and the cerebellum has the greatest connections to our frontal lobe. So now understand, too, that postural muscles that feel gravity are a type of motor system. When I say motor, I mean muscles. And understand that behavior is an expression. How is behavior expressed? It's expressed through the motor system. So, which is why I titled this, Behavior and Motor Problems, because understand that thinking is the next evolutionary step in movement, because now the organism could predict the movement before they did it. That's going to promote survivability, right? How come we see so many dead squirrels on the road these days? Because they don't have a good ability to predict their movements. They react. So thinking, that higher functioning, that new brain, that neocortex, thinking was the next internalization of movement. And that whole reddish area that I showed you on the screen, I'll go back to it a little bit. I don't know if everybody can still see it, but whoops. Where is it? This whole region right here is all surprise. I'm not sure if you can see it anymore. Probably not, but that whole frontal region is associated with movement, yet the final movement is only a little teeny strip of that big red part of the brain. All the processing, how fast should I not move? Should I go, should I not go? All of that is processed through that frontal lobe and the deep regions of the brain that are connected to it. I hope I answered that question.
Okay, so when you're talking about movement, then you're talking about big muscle group movements, like that type?
That's one way to do it. It depends on what side of the brain is. It depends on really what you see on exam.
Okay.
But it's usually a combination of both. It's usually a combination of fine motor exercises and gross motor exercises.
Okay. We did a webinar not too long ago on sensory issues, and that whole movement kind of thing was part of that webinar as well, and the importance of that with kids that are overstimulated. So it would kind of work the same way then.
I'm not. I wish I saw the seminar to comment on it, but
But in any event, it's movement, though. Would be
it's movement. That's correct.
Okay.
Because understand, one of the greatest sense organs in your body, the greatest sense organ in your body is the inner ear. It sends 1 million impulses per second into your brainstem, 24/7, even when you sleep. The spine is the next guy, 10,000 per second. So movement is a big deal. It's a really big deal.
All right, we have a couple questions on medications. What are your thoughts on medications and their effectiveness in general?
I would like to leave that to my medical scholars. However, I think medications have a place. However, medications, my biggest beef, I guess, with medications is that they don't go to one side of the brain. So understand, from my perspective, I understand that people get help by medications. A lot of the medications that especially the kids with these problems are helped with are stimulants. Mm-hmm. Well, stimulants are going to increase stimulation to the brain. To me, that's their problem with these kids, is that they don't have enough stimulation to the brain. Their postural systems, the systems that feel gravity, for whatever reason, are not functioning either in a balanced way or not enough. So stimulants help these kids because they increase stimulation to the brain. However, it doesn't go to both sides. So typically what I get from parents is they will say, well, the medications helped, but there's still something wrong with my kid. So and why? Because it goes to both sides.
Okay. And I also think then, in a sense, you end up treating more of the side effects. End up treating the side effects of multiple medications if you're not careful.
Well, there are all kinds of problems with medications with these children and everything else. But that's really more, I think, somebody in the med who prescribes a lot of that stuff and deals with it more would be better to answer those. I hate to be a cop-out on that one.
No, fair enough. I understand. You touched on dementia and Alzheimer's. Could you just flesh that out a little bit more and what you see as a connection here?
Well, here's the thing. They're now finding that people with head traumas and people who have had certain inflammatory, people with high contact sports, etc., they end up developing the same plaques. We're starting to see the same exact plaques in these people as we see in people with Alzheimer's. Yet they don't have Alzheimer's. So when I first read that first study where they showed that brain, head traumas, they found the same exact plaques in people with head traumas that they found in Alzheimer's, I thought, ooh, that's very interesting, because I never really thought the plaques were the problem. It's something else. And that seems to be the case, is that, in my opinion, and I'm just going on my gut feeling on this, is that what you're really seeing is that an inflammatory response in the brain is causing the plaques, because you get a lot of inflammation with a head trauma. So are the plaques the problem, or is there some other mechanism causing an inflammatory process in the brain that's now allowing it to degenerate? So how do you override that? Well, with Alzheimer's, basically what happens in a lot of these dementias is, when you look at brain specimens after these people pass away and you get a look at their brain, you can see that there's more crevices between those little fluffy bumps. Like when you look at the cortex of the brain in that picture, there's little crevices between these big lobes of the brain. And what they're finding is that these lobes start to atrophy on these people. In other words, just like your arm would atrophy if you pinched a nerve in your neck, you're starting to see the brain itself atrophy. And I think they should be focusing more on the inflammatory process that goes on in these people as opposed to the plaques, because I think the plaques are probably an end result. And I really think that's what they're going to find down the road, because they also find these plaques in people who haven't had traumas and don't have Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. So I think we're spending a little bit, or the researchers could maybe, do something else.
I'm sorry.
Does that answer the question?
I believe so, yeah. We'll see if there's anything that comes back on it.
Understand, when I get these folks coming into me, the thing that I try to do is create more connections in the area that I see as atrophying. And, sometimes it depends on how far gone they are, but sometimes you have success in bringing function back.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned, going back to the dementia thing for a second, you mentioned this part of the brain that you call the older brain.
Yes, the limbic brain.
Okay, people with Alzheimer's or dementia literally kind of go back in time, and they end up in some childhood situation using that, if you will, that older part of their memory anyway. Is there any connection there at all,
I believe
or would you
so.
speculate?
Well, no, I believe so. And I'm probably speculating because this isn't really my field as far as neurology.
I understand that, yeah.
But I remember doing searches for other things in neurology, and I came across a video where it showed how the brain, it was like a video of the brain growing to adulthood, and then they showed what it looks like in an Alzheimer's patient, and it looked like the video just went in reverse. It almost went backwards in the same way. So that is what happens. That's what I was kind of saying, is that this newer brain starts to atrophy, and you can see it on MRI sometimes, where you'll start to see increased spaces between these bumps, because the way our brain works is it's in like a layer type of distribution where all the cells of our brain are really on the outside of the brain. The word cortex means bark. So really all the cells are just on the outer layer of the brain, and then the rest of the brain are all these tracts running away from those brain down into deeper regions of the brain in our body. So those outer layers, that newer brain is going to atrophy first because they came last. They're the most fragile. It's the same thing I see with the ADHD kids and Tourette's and all these different things, is that you'll see high levels of limbic activity in their brain. There are certain muscles that are more limbic than other muscles. So you can test those muscles and see, are they very strong or are they weak? And I don't think I've ever seen a degenerated limbic brain. What you really see are the newer regions of the brain that can't gate it, can't regulate it. That's what that picture I was showing you with the schizophrenia there, where it shows that the brain loses that ability to regulate itself.
All right, thank you. I'm going to have some questions about stimulation and,
Okay.
you know, the good old question of the video games. And I guess it's more about, is one form of stimulation worse or less of a problem than some other form? And video game kind of falls into that category.
Okay, well, if we think about, you know, video games and video screens in general, okay, most visual stimulation excites the old brain, excites that limbic brain. As a matter of fact, there's really only one type of eye movement that does not. Everything else excites that old brain.
Okay.
So it may not be the content, it's just using your visual system so much without associated body movements. Think about when kids are playing video games, how much of their body's in motion? Very little. Yet they're, you know, you watch them play them and you'll see their teeth are grinding, and they're, you know, they're jerking their body as if they were in motion or as if they were in a battle, but they're not moving. That's a big mismatch. That's not how our ancestors' visual systems were grown and designed. That's not how they evolved. So I really think that when it comes to, you know, video games and visual stimulations, not all of them are bad because I use them in my practice to help people. But you have to be very careful because understand that all visual stimulation excites that older brain. So you have to be careful, you know, how much you use them, how long, what types, you know, et cetera. And then, you know, this could be a whole nother lecture on color and, you know, the types of visual stimulation, big things, small things, you know, contrast things. There's you know, many things with vision that have effects on our brain. So does that answer your question?
It does, and it leads to another one. If you had, for example, going back to the video game again, where it's, you know, it's all eyes, then is really what you're saying. So you're overstimulating that part of your brain. So it would seem then the stimulation, if there is to be stimulation, needs to be more balanced. Would that be a fair way to say that?
That would be correct. Absolutely. You would want to combine stimulations. Like in my home, I don't have chairs in front of my computer. We have rocker boards.
Okay.
And rocker boards are these little things that you stand on. It's like a wooden board that you stand on that rocks back and forth. And basically what it's doing is to stand on it, you have to use your spine a lot because you're balancing yourself. So, you know, if you're using that and you're standing upright, you're not sitting, and you're using your spine even more than you normally would just standing, it tends to be a little bit more of a stimulation, and I believe it's a little bit less than you know, it's a better way to use a computer than sitting on your behind. I think they should have these in schools. They would be wonderful for that because a lot of times kids get very fidgety in classrooms and things because there's not enough motor activity in the day. I understand some schools don't even have gym class anymore.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because those boards were something that came up in our sensory webinar as well about, you know, the use of those boards. I have a question about stimulating the brain. So how do you stimulate the brain? If gravity is 95% of the stimulation, does that go back to that board situation?
Okay, well, that's one way you could do it. Remember, walking is a series of balancing on one leg. So that's one way you could do it also. I try to get all of my patients, just about everybody walks through my door, I stick on a walking program. And I have to tell you, the people who do it always do the best. But our muscles, the receptors in our muscles are a little bit different than other receptors in our body in that they have the ability to change their sensitivity. I don't want to get too technical here, but if you think about it, the back of your eye, there's a retina that picks up light. Well, there's a muscle in front of it called the iris, the colored part of our eye, that allows more light or less light to come in because the retinal cells on the back of our eye don't have a way to gate what comes in. Okay? The ear, the same thing. If we're listening to, we go to a rock concert, and my ear rings the next day. Well, there's a muscle inside my ear that tugs on my eardrum when too much sound comes in to make it tighter so we don't tear it, we don't damage, the rest of my inner ear that hears, the cochlear cells. So there's different other receptors in our body. They had to grow something else to regulate themselves. Muscle spindles, which are the little receptors in our muscles, they're a little bit different in that they have the ability to regulate themselves, and that's done through the frontal lobe. Once again, that new part of our brain has a way to gate how much stimulation it gets from gravity through muscle spindles. So, well, then the answer then is, well, how do we change the muscle spindle? Through muscle movement. That's how you do it.
Okay,
so what would be an example of that in my office? I may give kids rocker board exercises. I adjust people. That is a type of muscle movement. I will give them exercises here and exercises that are performed at home, because those are all ways to change the sensitivity of that muscle, so now it's going to feel gravity differently. And you'll see this in a lot of the kids, the slumped shoulders. I had, I almost didn't think of it, but slumped shoulders, and the kids that, slump in a chair. I mean, they just can't sit up because they can't resist gravity. These are usually kids that are kind of lean and a little hyper, hypotonic, rather, decreased tone in their muscles. They usually have, the double joints, people with the double jointed. Sometimes they're not really double jointed. Their muscle tone is just so low because those muscle spindles are not set properly. So in other words, you have to stretch that muscle so far before it sends a message up to your brain that, forget it, your brain's never going to get anything from gravity. So the exercises we do and the motor movements that we do are designed to try to reset the sensitivity of those muscles so that it starts kicking in that connection between the cerebellum and the frontal lobe, and then the frontal lobe starts to gate it itself.
Okay.
Does that answer your question? Hopefully that wasn't too technical.
Yep. That was good. I have a question about your treatment. Is your treatment then based on a physical assessment and parent interview?
Both.
Both, okay.
My history form is pretty lengthy, and then I do parent interviews, and then we do an exam on the child.
Okay.
Or the adult. I mean, I see a lot of adults in my practice too. I'm not all kids, but there's a lot of adults with these problems too. I understand there's a program, somebody told me today, about the criminal brain.
The criminal brain?
The criminal brain. There's some TV show or some news show, or somebody's doing a series on the criminal brain. I don't know, they didn't know or couldn't tell me what station it was on or whatever, but I believe it's a big network station. And they're doing a series of these, so you can probably Google it. And I guarantee what you're going to see is these people have low lateral prefrontal, low new brain, and high limbic brain. I remember seeing a show once on a police show, one of these catch the criminal kind of shows, Forensic Files, or one of those. And I remember the policeman at the end of it said, well, criminals aren't very smart. They make a lot of mistakes. They're not that hard to catch sometimes. And I remember thinking, yes, that's because they don't have a very good lateral prefrontal cortex. They're running on impulse.
Somebody has contributed the fact that they think it's criminal minds that you might be talking about.
Criminal minds.
Is that it? Yeah.
Thank you. And, I haven't seen any of it, but I'm going to try to look for it because I'm curious to see what they find. Because if you look at all the, all the things that I've read on those people, and I have to tell you that, I have a little joke in here sometimes that, I've never seen anybody in a criminal, you read a headline in the newspaper, this one, did some horrible thing to their family or whatever, or they all have head tilts. They either have a head tilt, a droopy eye, a droopy mouth. Something's not balanced. You'll see it. You'll see it in their physical makeup.
We'll pay more attention.
Pay more attention to that. You'll see it. I haven't seen one yet that didn't.
All right. I have a question from a mom who says her son with TS never crawls. Does that have anything to do with these sorts of balance issues that you're talking about?
Yes. Children are born with certain primitive reflexes. These are reflexes that promote their survivability as babies. So, for instance, you touch a baby's palm and it's going to grab you, right? Everybody thinks a baby loves you. Look at he's grabbing my hand. Sorry, that's a reflex. He's not doing that on purpose. So there's a lot of reflexes that babies are born with. You stroke a baby's cheek, and they're going to open their mouth and turn towards that stroke to nurse. So these are reflexive things that babies do. Well, a baby getting up and starting to crawl is a type of reflex. And these movements that the baby, it's a learned motor pattern, but how to do it is somewhat reflexive. And if a child doesn't go through these all the way, going through these primitive reflexes and developing them as a baby brings on the posture reflexes. So, as I said before, from about when a child is born, really from the moment of conception to about 18 to 24 months of life, the baby is using mostly the primitive parts of its brain, and mostly that right brain. So they're going through a series of development. They're that nonverbal communication, all different things. I don't want to get into too much here, but as the child continues to grow, they need to go through certain motor activities. And around at 18 and 24 months, these certain baby motor activities should be about done, and they start to switch to a left brain, more using the left brain. So the child starts to become better at speech. They start speaking with sentences. Instead of, walking across the room in a big waddle and then plopping on their rear ends, they're now chasing their Tonka truck across the floor. They start to become handed. We start to see that right and left brain dominance start to develop. Yep. And if the child didn't go through all those stages, in other words, if your child didn't crawl, then most likely those posture reflexes did not kick in all the way, and therefore they're retaining some of these primitive reflexes. And to me, primitive reflexes are just evidence that those posture reflexes aren't kicking in, as the posture reflexes that grow are frontal lobes. Okay. So to get that new brain to grow, you got to get those posture reflexes to kick in, and primitive reflexes are evidence that that has not happened. And there's ways to test for those.
Okay. We're almost out of time. I have a couple more questions at this point, where I just want to mention to folks, if any of you do drop off, that there is an exit survey that we would like you to just fill out. So watch for that if you have to leave. And I'm going to go back to Dr. Kiechlin with a couple other questions. Can you talk a bit about brain symmetry and pupil size?
Sure. Pupils are a wonderful little muscle to look at because we have two of them, and the drive to them is associated with each side of the brain. In other words, the constriction of your left pupil, let's say, is a consequence of activity in your left brain. Let me change that differently. It's a consequence of activity in your brainstem where the neurons that constrict that pupil live or dilate it and constrict it. However, that region of the brain is fed by your frontal lobe on the same side. As a matter of fact, 10% of your brain fires right down into that area that constricts or dilates that pupil. So it's an extremely, extremely good tool to use. And typically in these children, you'll see that their pupils are not the same size. And why? Because their brains are not balanced. So you can also have a difference in pupil size from a cerebellar problem, because when the cerebellum is going up to that frontal lobe, it passes through the same region. So, for instance, if I might give somebody a cerebellar stimulation in a chair, let's say, by spinning them, when I do that, I'm looking at their pupil to change size to know that that message is going through there and heading up to the brain. Okay, so that's one way. The larger, typically now, the larger the pupil size, okay, the weaker the brain is. Not always. Because if your frontal lobe is so weak that your limbic brain, that older brain, is running unchecked, then the pupil will actually be smaller in size. But when you shine a light in the other eye or in that eye, it responds differently. That's how you know what's going on. So you're going to see a difference in the response time. Meaning that if I shine a light, how fast does that pupil constrict? And then how fast was it able to dilate again? And that's how you can tell what scenario is going on. Is it a really heavy limbic windup where, that limbic brain is just not being inhibited, very well at all? Or is it just that your frontal lobe's weak and it's just not firing down to that area, and your limbic brain isn't going crazy at this point, let's say? Does that help? Does that answer?
I hope so. I didn't get a subsequent question on that, so it satisfies me. Thank you.
And what's nice about the eyes is you have two of them, so you can really assess each side of the brain. It's one of the tools. It's only one test. You have to do the whole thing to pull it all together.
All right. I have a question that just overall, in terms of working with the child and with the situation that you're working with, and the question came from a teacher as to whether or not you would ever ask for teacher input. I mean, how would that work in a classroom setting?
Often what I will do with many of the children is that I have a survey that I give to the teachers. It's just a very quick behavioral survey. The parents fill it out before they come. And then when they're in school, I mean, that isn't the case now, but when they're in school, I'll ask the teachers, to fill them out as well, and to help me update on, is it just at home that we're having issues, or is it at home and school, and are they seeing a difference in the child and their behavior? So yes, I do both. I do a survey with the parents and the teachers.
So you do a before and after then, so you're getting kind of
I do it out throughout the course of care.
Yeah.
We do that.
Oh, okay. All right. So you.
And that's a very helpful tool, because it's nice because you start to see, hopefully you'll start to see things getting better. So it's a nice, you get to see that change.
A nice measurement, yeah.
Yes.
And it happens so much with TS kids too, that teachers will say they don't see something in the classroom, and the parents will say that they do. So when you've got some kind of ongoing assessment, then that's really a nice tool.
And think about it. Why might that be the case? Because the environments are different.
True.
Right? And of course, I mean, kids play their parents, don't they? I mean, they do.
Well, yeah,
they definitely play. I mean, we all played our parents. So.
Yeah, but also, depending on what's going on in the classroom, the kid will potentially try and suppress tics just so that he's not calling attention to himself. So the teacher may be, I don't see it, and the parent may be like, you should see it at home, kind of.
Absolutely. I've seen many children tell me that they've held it in all day. You'll see this especially with the more teenage year kids who have Tourette's. Is they're able to hold it in all day, but when they get home, they feel like they just got to explode in tics, get it out of their system. It's like something they've been holding in a burp all day. They just have to let it out, kind of a thing. So absolutely, that's the case. And that's hard for them. A lot of times it's hard.
It sure is. All right, Doctor, thank you very much. That ends our Q&A period for tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You are so welcome. I'm just going to turn the program back over to Kelly for a couple of last-minute details.
Okay.
Thank you for joining our webinar on brain balance and its relationship to movement and behavior. There is an exit survey which should show on your screen as you leave. Please fill out the evaluation on the exit survey. The discussion board will be open tomorrow and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to the site, and anybody wishing for copies of the slides, just email me and I'll be happy to send them to you. Our next presentation is Childhood Bullying, What We Know and Can Do, presented by Stuart Green, and is scheduled for September 29th, 2010. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Kiechlin, for your presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending.